Now, the government, in the lead up to these reforms, had focused almost exclusively on the need to get the private sector more involved, to get them into deep water exploration. The reforms that emerged, of course, after negotiation with the PRI meant that that was never going to happen. However, the government got very, very enthusiastic immediately afterwards and told all of us that the problem is now solved. They said, the big play now is not deep water. You can forget about deep water for the time being. We know there's 30 to 50 billion barrels there, but yeah, we can do without it. Instead, let's focus on Chicontepec. Starting in 2009, the government estimated that Chicontepec would produce 72,000 barrels a day. Now, that was up from 16,000 barrels a day at the beginning of 2008. And they argued that between 2009 and 2017, average production would be over 440,000 barrels a day. And crude production would reach its peak in 2016. Some government estimates put the peak level at around 780,000 barrels a day from Chicontepec. Chicontepec has not performed. Chicontepec now is up at around 45,000 barrels a day. And it was supposed to be at 72,000 in 2009. The reason for that is that Chicontepec, as I said, is this highly complicated and complex geological field. It's very, very difficult, it's very, very time-consuming to get the oil out of there. These are the kind of projections that the government put forward in late 2008, early 2009. Believing that Chicontepec would save the Mexican oil industry, that there would be billions of dollars of new revenue coming in, that there would be hundreds of thousands of barrels of oil added to national production. You can see there that the orange little section there was to do with the deep water exploration. That would begin, production would begin in 2015. That was already enormously optimistic. If you had 0 barrels of oil production from deep water in 2009, and you weren't even exploring yet, in order to find it and get those fields working by 2015, you'd have to have discovered it pretty much that day. And the government was nowhere near ready to go out there and find it. The government did, in fact, Pemex began to go out and look for deep water oil, drilled 5 wells, and one of them began producing little sips of oil coming up. Now, as most of you in the room know, it's incredibly expensive to drill for oil in deep water. Pemex was spending between $200 and $250 million per well. So if you multiply that by 5, $1.25 billion spent for very, very little oil coming out from underneath the ground. Continued decline largely because of the delays in implementing. The changes to the board took over a year to come about, partly because the new members of the board needed to be negotiated politically. The new regulatory commission took 1.5 years to be appointed. And when it was appointed, it was disappointed because nobody knew what the heck it was supposed to do. I remember speaking to one of the new members, one of the new commissioners, and I said, congratulations on your appointment, this is fantastic. And he said, great, I have no idea what I'm supposed to do. I said, what do you mean? He says, well, we've been given a mandate, but we're constantly told by the Energy Ministry that no, we can't do that. We go to Pemex and Pemex doesn't listen to us. We're producing lots of information and nobody seems to care about it. Now, since then, the Hydrocarbons Commission has actually begun to play a much more active role in the debate in Mexico, putting out reports that have been particularly damning about Chicontepec. And in fact, that's been one of the sources of information that has been responsible for the government and now Pemex pulling back from Chicontepec. The Tula refinery, as I mentioned earlier on, a very exciting new refinery project that made many of us think this is going to cost between $9 and $10 billion to build this thing. Wouldn't it have been better, given the margins involved, to have spent those $9 or $10 billion in exploration and production? The margins on discovering oil are just much, much bigger, aren't they? Wouldn't this have been a better thing? No, this was politically expedient. Because the Mexican newspapers, the Mexican press and media had been dominated by these numbers about how much refined product was being brought into Mexico, the government felt the need to build a new refinery. The contracts themselves, the incentive-based contracts, brought into law in 2008, November of 2008, just emerging January of 2011. The first contracts that are beginning to emerge in 2011 are contracts for mature or declining fields. Very, very little new oil is going to be brought out of those fields. It'll be significant, but not really significant in the overall picture. Secondly, the second kind of contract, which will come out in the middle of this year or the latter part of this year, will deal with shallow water fields, where Pemex already can go in there and get the oil out. So we're not quite sure why those are being issued at all. The deep water contracts, in terms of incentive-based contracts, the government has said will be issued in the summer of 2012, just before the next election. Not quite sure what the political significance of that is. What I am sure of is that another year and a half from now, before we even get the contracts out there, then there'll be a huge debate, then there'll be some kind of negotiation going on between whoever's interested in those contracts and Pemex and the government. We're not going to see any kind of real private involvement in deep water exploration and production in Mexico before the end of 2012, maybe 2013. First question. Generally, in Mexico, as many places around the world, Petrobras is seen as being sort of the example to follow. And there's a certain irony, which is that Pemex, when it was created, and for many years Pemex was seen as being an ideal national oil company in many, many ways. Petrobras itself looked to Pemex for leadership sort of back in the 1980s. Now it's the other way around. Pemex looks at Petrobras and says, gosh, what are they doing? You know, this is an amazing thing. Why can't we do the same thing as them? Two questions kind of lie within that first question. One is that could Pemex become more like Petrobras? And I think that that may be part of the answer, is that maybe we need to follow the Petrobras model for Pemex, to sell some of the shares of Pemex to private hands to get some kind of better management of the company involved. But the question you directly asked was, would Petrobras be a more acceptable partner than a BP and Exxon, etc.? Yes, it would. But until we get the constitutional change, we're not actually going to make that possible. So, back in 2008, Petrobras was very heavily involved in Mexico in a public relations campaign and an education campaign for the elites, trying to convince people that change was necessary. As I mentioned to a couple of people here earlier on, Milton Costa, who was the head of the Petrobras office in Mexico City at the time, he had previously been in charge of the public relations campaign when Petrobras went private, essentially, in Brazil. And that's one of the reasons why he was brought to Mexico. Now, Petrobras worked very, very closely with Pemex, with the government, with the media, trying to get the message out there. And beyond that, and perhaps more significantly, there was one moment in 2008 when news reports came out that Petrobras had offered to work alongside Pemex in the Gulf of Mexico to discover oil in deep water. The government immediately said, well, of course we can't accept that. And then Petrobras came out and said, it wasn't us that suggested it. It was floated behind the scenes to probe, to see if Petrobras was interested in it. They said, yes, of course we'd be interested, but it's not going to happen. So Petrobras, if change was to happen, I think that Petrobras would most likely be the first candidate for cooperating with Pemex.